ba da boo, la ba da boo, la ba da boo da boo. La ba da boo, la ba da boo, la ba da boo da boo.
Back again for chapter 8, JIvaka, the doctor. The doctor is in. Sorry. I just want to jump back to what we were just talking about because I think it is a little interesting and it may resonate with other people. I just jumped on the audiobook train maybe within the last 2 months, really coinciding with our beginning this process. And Mitchell and I were talking about just what it's like to read versus listen to a book and like that experience. Like I always thought I wouldn't be into the audiobook thing, but I've really liked having both options as I process this book. And my rhythm has become listening to it all the way through. I always listen to things fast. So I'm at like 1.7 or 2 times speed, and I'll do it while I'm exercising, or I'll do it while I'm taking a walk. And then I listen to it a couple times during the week and read it at least once or twice too. And there's just a real difference in like the attentional aspect of processing a book when you're reading it versus listening to it. And I guess we didn't say this before, but I'm just thinking too, like, I wonder what like benefits there are. I mean, there have to be benefits from like being able to process in both ways effectively. And I feel like when I initially started, the first thing I noticed is I can't process what I'm listening. I can't process a book when I'm listening to it because I'm thinking about other things or I'm distracted and so I've had to develop the skill of being able to listen to a book. It's very different, you know?
Yeah, that is interesting. I was kind of wondering if like the type of book might matter. Like, probably the only time I've tried to listen to anything was a novel, and it's like I just couldn't really do it. It's like I didn't feel like I was getting anything that I was hearing. But then I wonder if maybe something like this, which is maybe like a little more just informational, I don't know if that would kind of make a difference. But yeah, probably just different skills. I guess, the visual, I guess, is the big difference, obviously. I mean, I've never really thought about that, but I guess I'm a pretty visual person.
Yeah. Well, and there's also like, I know for me, I should be able to read faster, but I read super slow. I think because I'm such an auditory person, like I have a really hard time reading if I'm not also hearing it in my head, and that's almost always at speech speed, so I've seen people read much faster than I do. And I try to do that thing where I just look at the lines and process the words.
Right.
But I can't do that. Like I need to hear it. And I can do it maybe for a line or two, and then I get tripped up and I just go back to reading in my head,
Right. Yeah, I'm the same way for sure. I consider myself a pretty slow reader.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention from last week, we had a pretty good conversation, unfortunately, after we turned the microphones off last week. And one of the things that I was thinking about that was we talked about cultural context and what I might call like the credulity gap. That's a word, right? Credulity. Yeah. So like, yeah. So, and what I mean by that is like, I feel like we were talking about this secular approach to Dharma and why it's important. And so much of the beginning and probably the middle really too of the Buddhist path or the path of Dharma is just coming to recognize some very simple and immediate, pragmatic, really secular things in a way, which are just like, it's hard enough for people to believe that they are not their emotions, that there is some separation between themselves and the emotions they experience, and they don't have to react to or be wrapped up in every feeling that arises, that there is a way to observe those kinds of things and work more skillfully with them. That's a very hard thing to believe. And we are really kind of asking people in the beginning to believe that. We're also asking them to believe in like the incredible power of sitting down and not doing anything.
Right.
Just sitting still and like paying attention to your breath. Like, even if someone's invested in coming and trying to learn meditation, a lot of times they still don't really believe it. They want to believe it, but they're, initially, really, we all have to go through this process of just coming to see more and more. Oh, this is really true. So we're asking people to believe stuff that's really hard to believe right from the beginning, including that we all have the potential for awakening. Like, we all have this potential to wake up to a much more flourishing experience in life. And that we not only have that potential of awakening, but we can and do experience it sometimes, all of us. Like, that kind of stuff is so important and so much of the path, and it's already so hard to believe. So what happens when we also throw in on top of that strongly culturally derived ideas from an entirely different culture? Like, what debt are we accruing there? Like, I was thinking it in terms of like credit or debt. Like, if people come in, they really want to get it. They're invested in believing a thing, even if they're not there yet. We have some credit there. But when we start to pile on things like local spirits, and I mean, I know there's value in all of these things. I'm not knocking them. I'm just saying, like, let's be conscious of the fact that when we start to throw in this totally different culture's ideas, like, what debt are we creating, and what potential impediment is that creating in people believing the basic stuff we talked about, that is, just like recognizing that sitting down and doing nothing has a benefit, things like that, or that you have the potential to wake up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he makes a point at the end of the chapter for today, actually, that's kind of related to this, which is like, maybe the contact that folks have with what we might call like a kind of secular mindfulness is actually, in reality, maybe contact with the real heart of the Dharma. And, not, it's like maybe sometimes we treat that as if it's some sort of watered down version of Buddhism, when really it might be like the most important thing. And there's a lot of kind of, in some ways, unnecessary elaboration that's just built up around that essential message.
Yeah, and I think that elaboration may be what sends people out the door before they've had a chance to recognize some of the more immediate and practical aspects. Mm-hmm. And I guess that just helped me to recognize more of the why behind this book and its mission, is that can we find what is essential and culturally relevant, in this context.
It may be sort of a matter of like priority, like if we could maybe get in the habit of presenting the essential message kind of first, there could be room for elaboration. And then if one were wanting to employ the sort of elaboration techniques and context and all that, it would be maybe more productive, because it would be actually building on the essential point rather than kind of like weeding through all this stuff to get to the essential point, which I do kind of think is what happens a lot of times. I probably went through some version of that myself. It's like you sort of like go through a lot of hoops just to like finally get the simple thing.
Yeah. And maybe that snake analogy from the beginning here, like maybe we do need to get at least nipped at a few times before we're ready for that, so I understand, like, I'm not trying to take all the things taught in this book and make them into another set of rigid truth claims. When I bring things like this up, I mean, I know you know that, but for the listener, like I'm just trying to kind of counterbalance, I think, a lot of, things that we maybe don't talk about enough. And so I'm not, I do know there's a lot of avenues into this practice that may come through a slightly misplaced fascination with a culture, or a religion.
Mhm.
Like that may actually lead to the great outcome of finding that essential point of Dharma.
Right.
And I know that, but I think that we also can't just lean on that to be, our marketing or our pedagogy. Like,
right. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's kind of powerful in the sense that it's both entry points are sort of valid, and the more options you can have, the more skillful the teaching really is.
yeah. Well, you want to jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So this first part 1 is short and it's also good. I was just going to read it all. So do you want to read part 1? I'll read the epigraph and you read part 1.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So the epigraph here is, suppose a man needing a snake, wandering in search of a snake, saw a large snake and grasped its coils or its tail. It would turn back on him and bite his hand or arm or one of his limbs. And because of that, he would come to death or deadly suffering. Why? Because of his wrong grasp of the snake. So too, here some misguided men learn the Dharma, but having learned the Dharma, they do not examine the meaning of the teachings with intelligence. They do not arrive at a reasoned understanding of them. Instead, they learn the Dharma only for the sake of criticizing others and winning in debates, and they do not experience the good for the sake of which they learn the Dharma. These teachings, being wrongly grasped by them, conduce to their harm and suffering for a long time. And that's from the Alagadupama Sutra.
I actually made a note on the epigraph this time, which I typically haven't, and it was just simply that, like, the point that the Dharma is for practical application to ourselves.
Yes.
I mean, that sounds like a super simple thing, right? But I mean, it's like, it's a super simple thing that we probably can't say too much, because like, I feel like just coming face to face with that in and of itself is kind of powerful. Like if we even like every morning, if we check ourselves before our practice, like, why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
It's important. It really is, because like it's like it's easy to get in the habit of practicing or being associated with these teachings for so many different reasons. I mean, most of us probably are not consciously learning Dharma so that we can like be more right than other people, like it says here. But I mean, it is still easy to miss applying it to yourself, even after so long, like, or just like reminding yourself, the reason that I'm doing this is for no other, like, it's not to feel cool, not to be cooler than other people, not to be, fascinated by this, different kind of thing. It really is just to like try to affect some kind of internal change, or something to that effect, however we want to say it, get back to what we really are, whatever. I think it's important though to kind of remind ourselves of that. It's like having to be honest about why we're doing it.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that relates a lot to karma. Like I appreciate that comment, and it reminded me of how I've often thought about when we think about other people's karma, when we start to like try to examine other people's karma, like how that can only end badly for all involved.
Right.
Like we don't have the ability to figure out their karma. And if we're doing it, there's probably some judgment at the core of that, and some we're creating some sort of hierarchy to make ourselves feel better. Or, I mean, I'm not coming. Yeah. I feel like I still, it's one of those thoughts I've had for a long time, but I don't necessarily feel like I've landed on the right language. But I think it's something worth contemplating: is, can we consider others' karma in any way that's productive? I really think it's just for us. I think that's what That
Yeah.
whole karmic theory is for us to think about, as was stated in an earlier chapter, what things led to where we are right now of what we know, and what things that we're doing now can impact our future. Like, I think it really only matters in our own context, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I agree. It's easy to think that maybe we've got a leg up because we have skillful practices or something. But like, you know, I see like sometimes like my behavior is, in my way of looking at it, way stupider than other people, you know, who may not be thinking of any of this sort of thing in the same way that I am, but they've found it just naturally, you know.
Yeah.
Like just because you have good methods doesn't mean you're doing any better.
Yeah. Yeah. And to that point, yeah, I think that's totally right. That's because what we ultimately need to find with the karma is, or with our karma, is our reactivity, you know, so that we can let go of it. And we need to see that that's, you know, that the additional suffering we create for ourselves, the hampering of the flourishing, occurs through that reactivity. And as long as we're or as reactivity, depending on how you look at it, and yes, I think that if we're going to turn our mental flashlight of karma on other people, I think it has to be for the purposes of compassion and to see, oh, they do that too, you know. We both do that. Yes, the karma may be the way that karma is manifesting, or the details of it may be very different than our own. But like, if we're going to be looking at others through the lens of karma, it needs to be with the goal of seeing like, oh, it may look very different, but we're all doing the same thing here.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, should I read this section 1?
Yeah, I love this one.
All right, let's go. In the parable of the snake narrated in the epigraph, Gautama presents his listeners with a stark warning. The Dharma he reached through his awakening and then dedicated his life to sharing with others is dangerous, something to be handled with skill and care. Mishandle it, he cautions, and it might destroy you. Not even the Dharma possesses an inbuilt safeguard to prevent it from being turned into yet another place in which we can, quote, love, delight, and revel, where once more the contingent and nirvanic ground of our life is obscured. All too often, in the name of Buddhism, people transform the Dharma into a belief system, a religious or ethnic identity, a dialectical tool that they employ to secure a place either in their own egoistic scheme of self-appraisal or in the various pecking orders established by society and the world. Far from dwelling in the radiant, open-hearted equanimity that allows them the freedom to risk responding to life unconditioned by reactivity, they prefer to encase themselves in an armor of fixed opinions, where they can feel self-righteous and impervious to criticism. This perhaps is why the Dharma is like a poisonous snake. If you seize a cobra by its body or tail rather than carefully gripping it by the back of its neck, it will whip around and sink its fangs into your flesh to inject its venom into your bloodstream. If you treat the Dharma as a set of dogmas rather than a liberative practice, it too will function as a toxin. It can poison and kill you. Metaphorically, a fixed place in which one delights and revels is a stasis comparable to death. By turning the Dharma into a static place, it too can become a living death rather than a source of life.
Well stated. Yeah.
Yeah. Which I guess is kind of, this is a more extreme sort of statement or illustration of kind of the same things we were just talking about, you know?
Yeah. I don't know. I think the rest of this chapter will expand on that. I don't have any particular notes on part 1 beyond that. I feel like that sort of sets the stage. Do you have notes?
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. But Well, so there was just one thing I wrote down. It was kind of like a note to self thing. And it was just the statement that we don't need to feel threatened. That was one thing that kind of came for me with this. And I think it is just the sentiment like that we don't really have to defend ourselves against the world. You know what I mean? Which I think is related to all this stuff that we're saying. It's like, I think when we associate ourselves with Dharma and practice Dharma, we do in a lot of ways develop a different view of the world than like what consensus culture presents. Like that's kind of undeniable. But at the same time, I don't think that we win anything by then using that different perspective as like he's saying here, right? Like as kind of an armor to where the world starts to feel like a threat. It's doing exactly what he's describing here. It's like an unnecessary level of like hindrance, you know, to allowing the teaching to like flow with life or help us flow with life, I guess. And I think that it's more like initially the Dharma helps us see things differently, but then, well, okay, let me say it like this. Initially, that different view that it helps us develop makes us feel different. We just see it differently now. It doesn't actually make us different.
I see. Know? Yeah.
It's just that we're finally seeing it how kind of for what it is. And then we have to start to learn to move again without feeling like we're somehow different or separate from what's going on around us. So I feel like there's a progression there. But like the main point is to like, we have there's no reason for us to feel threatened by the world, by the different appearances, like whatever, you know. It's like that just, I don't know, that kind of came up for me with this, is like to not feel threatened by differences of opinions or just like whatever, you know, whatever you meet can just be kind of incorporated into your situation.
Yeah. That reminded me of like the analogy about the waterfall when you start to meditate, and how all of a sudden it seems like you have all these thoughts and they're coming so quickly and they're powerful. And, you know, like I think a lot of times people think meditation is doing that, you know, and it's, no, you're
right.
Now you're actually like, rather than looking at distractions, you're actually looking at what's going on in your mind, you know, and seeing it differently, you know, and actually creating the working basis for all the practices that come later. But it can initially feel like, you know, something bad has been created when in fact it's just awareness, and it's not good or bad. It's just the situation that needs to be worked with. And we need to know the situation as it is before we can really make the right decisions to work with it.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. And then part 2, so we get into like, why would somebody want a snake? I think he's got a sense of humor that's like, it's pretty funny sometimes, like, because the way this one starts out, that's kind of like, you know, it's a great parable, but you know what he doesn't mention is, why would you want a snake? You know? And so he brings up like, it's quite possible it could be Ayurvedic doctors. And I guess there's been some research about how cobra venom can actually reduce the effects of arthritis, stiffness or arthritis. So, and he also mentions how Gautama often compares himself to a doctor. Like in the metaphor we keep coming back to about the arrow, and the surgery involved in taking the arrow out, the arrow of reactivity. And he also points out that this idea of cobra venom being used for arthritis, that reactivity itself could be compared to arthritis, because it causes inflammation, it causes stiffness, causes pain. And to that point, he says, just as there is something arthritic about cleaving fiercely to one's place, so there is a creative, mobile quality about seeing an awakening to one's ground. So there's such good metaphors in here. And this idea of this venom, and curing the inflammation and stiffness of reactivity. Then he jumps into something that I think comes up a lot, which is how is wanting to be enlightened or awakened different from wanting anything else? And I think this leads to a lot of questions you and I both have probably heard in Dharma teachings about, what's an acceptable kind of wanting. And he points out some of the semantic tricks we use, aspiration is acceptable, but craving is to be avoided. But it's true that all forms of desire are rooted in wanting to replace, as he says, an unsatisfactory state of affairs with an improvement. And the improvement can be anything from longer orgasms to the end of suffering, he says. And so I think it's good to just be clear that is the same thing, it's still some sort of want or desire. And it's in this spectrum, he says, that runs from lust to the highest spiritual aspirations, but it's still desire. And he uses the example of Shantideva talking about making his sole obsession vanquishing greed and hatred, but realizing there's a seeming contradiction in there. And that he has actually recommended some obsessions as a means to overcome others. But Stephen Batchelor says afflictions such as these destroy afflictions, so they're not to be abandoned. So Stephen Batchelor kind of lauds him for recognizing there's a paradox and seeming conflict at the heart of drama. But he says hating hatred and desiring the end of desire, he basically says that's how the path works. It's how it's done. So we can use word tricks to rationalize that, but that's just how it is. And it's like cobra venom, I think, or like a lot of medicines, we need the right dose. And that's really pivotal. Any comments on that so far?
Yeah, I mean, I just had noted that it's kind of like the principle of like homeopathic treatment.
Yeah.
Like a little bit of poison can help you to heal.
Yeah. And really we don't have it. The other thing is we don't have other more powerful tools to use. That's what we've got, right. Yeah. So we have to leverage what we've got. And he introduces here a new way of talking about the three poisons. He calls them want, aversion, and self-interest. And he uses this as a way to describe the three fires, which later came to be known as the three poisons. And he says, while poison is clearly a property of snakes, what possible connections might there be between snakes and fire? And he goes on to talk about the teaching the Buddha gave, his third teaching, basically, after he taught the 4 tasks and no self. He went off and to Gaia Head and met the fire worshippers, like this clan of fire worshippers. And there's a anecdote told there about he asked to go see the fire room, which I'm assuming is like their shrine room or something. And they warn him, like, there's a snake in there, be careful. And he goes in there and he sits, and the snake breathes smoke at him, and the Buddha responds by breathing smoke back at the snake. And the snake breathes more smoke and fire, and the Buddha breathes smoke and fire. And pretty soon the room is engulfed in smoke and flames. And by the morning, when they come to check on the Buddha, the snake is asleep peacefully in the Buddha's begging bowl. And he says that the snake's heat was mastered by his own heat. So, to your point about like homeopathy, again, here it's like, literally fighting fire with fire. I also feel like there's a point here too that we need to recognize that the Buddhist approach is not just forbearing any discomfort. It's not just waiting something out, and we don't just master suffering with inaction. Like sometimes there's definite action happening, and it can look like a bunch of smoke and flames even sometimes. But yeah, this is, I think that a great example of that homeopathic aspect.
Well, okay, yeah, I'm actually seeing here that he says the principle is homeopathic, treating like with like. He actually mentions that in here. So, but then I kind of had noted to read the next paragraph, if that's cool.
Yeah.
So it starts with saying that the problem with the three fires of greed, hatred, and confusion does not lie in their being hot, but in the havoc they cause when they get out of control. The tiniest spark can ignite one of these fires, an unkind remark, a depressing thought, an erotic image. Before we realize it, our minds and bodies are burning with revenge, self-pity, or lust. The parable of the snake might suggest that these fires are not to be extinguished, but regulated. Since emotions appear to be rooted deep in our limbic system as the legacy of biological evolution, regulation might be all that is possible and feasible. Rather than suffer fires that erupt and engulf us, we might learn how to adjust our inner airflow to enable them to become like the steady blue flame of a Bunsen burner. In this way, perhaps we could discover how to burn like miniature suns. I thought that paragraph was pretty good.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
that's, I mean, there's really like a kind of a lot there, you know, but I guess the basic principle is just that like the energy of our emotions, or just like our sort of the energy of our existence, is not really fundamentally the problem, you know, but it's kind of the relationship we have with it, and maybe how we can learn to like ride the waves of it a little more skillfully. There's several things I think to hear in that, but one is that the attempt to like overcome or extinguish these things is really just another way to get stuck or to be fixated on them. You know what I mean? It's not actually the most skillful sort of liberating approach to working with those energies. And I mean, I think that obviously that paragraph kind of sticks out to me because I think it's very in line with the sort of Vajrayana style logic and that style of kind of working with the emotions. You know, not necessarily trying to impede anything that may move through us, but rather to see it clearly and potentially just relate to the energy more skillfully. But that's a pretty powerful paragraph, and I really love the a couple of the sentences. You know, like he drops some powerful sentences, maybe throughout this entire book, really. But I feel like some of them stick out, like this: rather than suffer fires that erupt and engulf us, we might learn how to adjust our inner airflow to enable them to become like the steady blue flame of a Bunsen burner. In this way, perhaps we could discover how to burn like miniature suns.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And I think the other aspect of that too, I like how he points out that like these three fires are our evolutionary inheritance. Like they're hardwired, you know, into the brain. And so there's that aspect of becoming aware of a situation as it is pointed at here too. You know, like that's just how it is. We're not gonna like get rid of them entirely. We have to utilize them, you know, and like you said, it's a very Vajrayana view. Like all of this is the ground of Buddha nature. Like it's not like any of this is garbage that needs to be jettisoned. Like we just need to learn how to interact with it and use it for good, you know, for happiness and benefit. So,
and you know, I think it also kind of, to me, just brings up the recognition that kind of the goal or like the outcome of our training is not really to be like dead and lifeless. You know, it's like maybe we can burn like miniature suns, you know? I
Yeah.
mean, that's like a powerful image of being like full of life and vitality. And to me, it's like, I feel like having sort of through awareness, and through training ourselves, like having really harnessed the energy of existence. You know what I mean? Like maybe feeling more alive, you know, because it's like you have uh, developed a relationship with your energy. Like see it clearly and know that all of these energies and impulses that are moving through you are not like inherently like anything other than like just that energy, like powerful existential energy. You know, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to call it anger or greed or desire, whatever. It's just free energy, you know? And I think that's kind of getting into the area of like, you know, these things that we experience are really nothing other than emptiness. You know what I'm saying? Like it just is what it is.
Yeah. And it and we are alive and we got to roll with. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's no like way for it to be, you know? It's like it doesn't have to be all in like a box, you know?
Yeah, and there's this
Anyway, good
that
stuff there.
yeah, absolutely. And the idea of adjusting the Bunsen burner too, like by the way, I just had a memory that I used to get called that a lot in middle school and high school. It's kind of hard, hidden away. But yeah, Bunsen burner. Yeah. So, but yeah, I like the idea too of like adjustment. You know that like here it's clearly like another example of this is not just like a this or that path. We get this process of refinement rooted in like continually fresh awareness of our experience moment to moment. You know, like we got to make the adjustments and yeah. So this segment ends, of course, with the fire worshipers all converting and to the Dharma as taught by Gautama. And this is actually when he goes to Gaiahead to deliver his discourse on fire. And here he's using fire as a symbol of reactivity. As Batchelor says, it's a metaphor for greed, hatred, and confusion. And I want to read this teaching from Gautama. He says, everything is burning. One's entire sensorium is on fire: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, as well as the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, sensations, and ideas by coming into contact with which consciousness is generated. Burning with what? He asks. I say the world is burning with the fire of greed, the fire of hatred, the fire of confusion. It is burning because of birth, aging, dying, grief, sorrow, suffering, lamentation, and despair. And he also says, Batchelor says, to realize how life flares up, blazes, and overheats in this way is the first step in a process of mindful disengagement, which leads to non-reactivity, which in turn leads to the awareness that I am freed.
If it's cool with you, maybe I would go ahead and just finish the rest of that paragraph. Because actually, that paragraph was another one I had marked.
Yeah, go for it.
Understood in the framework of the fourfold task, nirvanic freedom is not the goal of the eightfold path, but its beginning. Detaching oneself from the burning world is not an end in itself, but it affords the possibility of letting those flames die down of their own accord so that one can respond to the world from the solar perspective of nirvana, unconditioned by the reactivity and pain that are consuming it.
Such a great metaphor.
Yeah. And like, I feel like important there is just like the idea that some developing realization of, as he puts it, nirvanic freedom is not really like the goal in the sense of it being an end, but it's just a perspective, like you just said in that a second ago. It's like a perspective from which we have to continually freshly relate to things like ongoing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like that phrase also in there, the solar perspective of nirvana. I mean,
Yeah. By the way, it's interesting because I've been re-engaging the music of Sun Ra, who is
oh wow, yeah,
a recurring figure in my life. I appreciate him more and more as the years go by. And first of all, his interviews are amazing. Just like watch like some YouTubes of him, being interviewed. He's always super profound and just thinking on a completely different wavelength. But yeah, I've been listening lately. I'd never really listened to his album Sleeping Beauty, and I want to recommend that.
Ooh.
Sun Ra's Sleeping Beauty. So
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, he's just so good. There's a new album that was just released too. I listened to as well yesterday. I mean, he's been dead for
really
30 years or something, but they're still releasing some of his material. But little digression. Cool. So then we also have Batchelor also points out that Mara is often depicted as a snake or a cobra. So we have here again, like if we think about that metaphor, it's like if we're going to grab the snake to use it, like that also means like the things we might think of as Mara, like we have to put those to use. And there's a encounter shared in here where the Buddha meets with Mara in this serpent form. And, but in this meeting, he doesn't respond like he did with the in the fire room with the fire snake. And this time he responds with inaction. He does nothing. And, so I think even in this chapter, even in this section where we're talking about the homeopathic approach, he still finds it important to share that that's not always the answer, and sometimes the Buddha did a different thing. These are all just options. And
right.
This also makes me think too of just a basic relationship with mindfulness and meditation, and how it's very easy to get hung up on the calming aspects of meditation and using meditation as a tool to alter our experience, as opposed to the other aspect of meditation, which is to familiarize ourselves with our experience. And I think you could actually argue it's actually more of the familiarization than the experience altering. It is a practice. But I think it's important. I mean, that just came to mind because this is another one of those circumstances where, yes, you can use meditation to make yourself feel a little better if you're stressed out. But if that's the only thing you're doing, it's not working, and you're really not getting the benefit out of the practice that you would be if you were employing it according, to what you need in a given situation.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, part 3.
Yeah.
So we get top-knot JIvaka, which is, I guess, like if you had a friend today named Mullet Mike, just call him by his hairdo. Top-knot JIvaka asks, basically he asked the Buddha, like, what do you think of all those that say all experiences are caused by previous actions? And the response from Gautama is, some experiences are caused by bile, some by phlegm, some by wind, some by all three together. Some experiences are caused by the change of seasons, some by poor care, some by sudden assault, and some are the fruit of one's actions. And this was really interesting one for me. So like, first of all, just one's previous actions are just one of many factors that contribute to how one is feeling in any given moment. And Batchelor points out this challenges this idea that like all suffering is a product of craving, which I think is a common Buddhist like way of thinking, a very simplified Buddhist way of thinking. But I want to point out that like this helped me to understand something about Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche's teachings, because I know we had listened to some teaching in retreat where he was asked a question about the planes on 9/11 and the people on those planes, and about how, according to karmic theory, if we have this idea that like everything is caused by previous actions, then we're also saying that those people who all died on those planes that went into the World Trade Center or the Pentagon or Shanksville, Pennsylvania, like they all did something bad to deserve that, and I think I may have told other stories about this. Like I know there's situations where people, have kids with cancer, and they said to a Buddhist, so I suppose you think it's their fault, but Kemba Rinpoche, when he was asked that question, said unequivocally, like, no, some stuff's just accidents. Some things just happen.
Right.
He didn't go into like the humors, the bile and phlegm and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
But it was interesting for me because I know in that moment, and really up until processing this chapter, I always was doing my own gymnastics to turn it back into karma. Like I was always kind of coming back to like, well, but there's also like community karma. And so they had the community karma of being in a human body that can be hurt. And they had the karma of being, on a plane, having the means to travel and having a job or a family that caused them to travel. So I was always kind of trying to draw a line back to karma for myself so I could feel sure about karma. Right. And so this really helped me. It reminded me of that and reminded me of how much I was trying to turn it into a certainty, even when my teacher said, no, some things are accidents,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I thought that, I definitely have heard Rinpoche say that on more than one occasion, like that there is like random occurrence, which is, pretty interesting. And I feel like also there's, the intersection of many, many people's different karma as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like not everything that happens in your life is your karma. Like your karma, I suppose, is mostly your reaction to what happens in your life. I think that's probably the safest thing to say. But like, I'm just thinking of the planes on 9/11. It's like there was karma involved with that situation, like in the sense that that would just, can't say for sure, but my feeling would be like the karma of the people that were motivated to do that. That's very powerful, seemingly negative karma. You know what I mean? But that karma could also show up as like a random occurrence for somebody else. Like it's not necessarily someone else's karma. It's people affected by a few people's karma.
Yeah. It's all contingent. I think that's
Yeah.
Yeah. It's weird because I think we want to feel like, even just in the idea of karma, we want to feel some kind of certainty. Like, oh, it works like that. Okay, now I understand.
Right.
And now I can go to sleep again.
Yeah.
Like, no, you don't get that kind of security.
And I think the main point, though, aside from like interesting speculation, is just definitely that, like, I heard, we're seeing it here, but definitely like I heard our teacher say multiple times in answer to questions that there is like random occurrence in the universe, so
yeah. And according, I think this maybe goes a little further, and maybe that's reflective of the Theravada context, but this goes a little further, even just to say, like, as a separate thing, that like the humors, the traditional, Ayurvedic humors, or I don't know if it's Ayurvedic, but the older medicine of bile and phlegm, and he doesn't say like that's caused by your previous actions. He says, no, it's caused by the bile and the phlegm. So it's like, like I think we might in the Tibetan context say, well, those things happen for a reason of something that happened in the past. But he's in this statement, he doesn't appear to be saying that. He says some things are the fruit of one's actions. So, some things just happen. And the other thing that this was intended, I think, to demonstrate, or the reason Batchelor included, is we see that Gotama had some knowledge of local medical theory and practices. And that's a good way of starting to introduce JIvaka. And one thing he says, just to wrap up this idea here about karma, he says, Anyone, this is Batchelor talking, he says, anyone who makes such sweeping claims as everything is caused by previous actions surpasses both what can be known by themselves and what is accepted as true in the world. Here, as elsewhere, the Buddha's analysis of the human condition is closer to that of a physician who seeks to understand the exact causes of a specific malady than to that of an enlightened sage who makes generalized truth claims about human nature. His next paragraph starts by saying, where might Gautama have acquired detailed knowledge of the medical traditions and practices of his day? And so, with that, let's close this episode, and everyone can wonder for the whole next week where maybe he got. I think I just said it 3 sentences ago, but yeah, let's wrap this episode up, and we'll pick up with the next part of this chapter. So,
cool.
Have a great week. See ya.